Hello, everyone. Today, we're going to talk about Chinese restaurants and COVID-19 racism. My name is Professor Bond, and we'll go over the history of racism in Chinese restaurants. So, positionality, I'm a Chinese restaurant kid. I worked in it my whole life, to high school in a Chinese restaurant in the Midwest. I'm from Bellevue, Illinois. So, that's my positionality. So before we talk about Chinese restaurant, we got to talk about how Asians are very much situated in terms of global dynamics and imperialism and colonialism. Now, there is a long hatred of Asians, not just Asian Americans, but Asians. And one of the biggest tropes of Asians is the yellow peril. This is this racist kind of stereotype that all Asians are exotic, erotic, sexual beings, untrustworthy. And you can see this throughout in many, many videos on and movies currently in 2021 on how they depict Asians. So again, this is a justification of taking over Asian countries, the yellow peril. You have to civilize them. So we take over the Philippines because the Philippines are, as quote, not civilized. They're not sanitized, right? We take over China, even though in China, the British addicted China to opium, which is like heroin. And of course, the Chinese looked and saw that their people were not doing well with this opium. And so they banned opium because it was destroying their country. And then what happened is Britain, because they wanted the supplies, they have very few natural resources, but China has a lot of natural resources. So then they started a war to get back Chinese to open up to get them addicted back to opium and also to get back their materials, which and in turn, China lost that war. And actually they call it a very disgraceful war. And that's when Britain took over Hong Kong. A lot of people don't remember or don't acknowledge that it was over opium, which is an addictive drug, which China did not want to get addicted to. So again, you see throughout history, right, the West has tried to expand into Asia, take over its lands, specifically Hong Kong and China, and imperialize, particularly into Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, into various countries all over Asia, and including the Middle East. And it's because of the yellow peril. Okay, so that's something it's used as justification. Now, I want to talk about the anti-Chinese acts and events. In 1871, a lot of people don't know that 18 Chinese in LA Chinatown was massacred. They're massacred by the local people and also police officers. That's why there's no convictions. And basically what happened was that Chinatown, they were actually pushed into that Chinatown redlined. They can live anywhere else. And then after that, they wanted to make a railroad in that Chinatown. And so instead of asking the Chinese to leave, they just mass shot them all and shot them in the face and lynched them. One of the worst heinous crimes and no convictions. I think there was maybe one conviction. Again, Chinese Americans could not actually testify against Anglo Americans, even though they're being murdered by them. Now, in 1875 was the Page Act. Now, this Page Act is really interesting. Now, this basically banned women, right, Chinese women from entering the country. They were considered of low moral turpitude, and so they had to prove that they were not prostitutes. Okay, so again, you see how they're trying to limit the population of Asians and not let them in and not let them reproduce. Now, is that happening in other places? People are not allowed to come to the United States. People put in cages. People forced sterilization. Well, look at the playbook for how they treated Chinese. Okay. Now, this is, of course, very correlated to Chinese restaurants. Now, all over, there are anti-Chinese race riots erupted in cities like San Francisco, Vancouver, Seattle, and even in Canada, right? Because there's the accusation that they're working for less wages. Now, The Untold Story of Chinese Restaurants in America by Heather L.R. Lee. And basically, Chinese immigrated for a better life. In 1849, there was the gold rush that came here. And I want to make clear that they always wanted to go back. They wanted to make money for their family and go back and support their family, of course. Mostly males came and they never intended to stay. And then they just want to send back money, right? But of course, unfortunately, in 1882, after they were 90% of the railroad, and I want you right now to Google I'd like you to Google the image on the Pacific Railroad connection between the West and the East, and look at that picture, and you'll see that not one Chinese person is in that picture. It's a black and white picture, and you'll see in the Pacific Railroad connection. Although 90% of the Pacific Railroad workers were Chinese, and they worked for half the price of the Anglos, such as the Irish on the West. So in 1915, to evade and bisect this Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned all Chinese again, because they're considered, right, the yellow peril, the exotic, erotic, and a diseased, right? There was a business visa. And then the business visa is a one way for Chinese to come into the United States. For 1910 to 1920, the Chinese restaurants doubled and several times doubled again and again. This is like Susan Carter's research at UC Riverside. So look her up. So you see the image, come out and ratify, come everybody, no more Chinese. Now, prerequisites for low-man loophole. That was the last the 1915 visa. Okay, I found that a great kind of a title in one of the articles. So in order to get to this business visa, I found this article online. You have to be 1 year as a Chinese restaurant owner in China. You have to have 2 white witnesses and investors to testify. So there's kind of a quid pro quo. You testify for me, I'll get you in. And of course, those were very much benefited those white investors. Now you have to create partnerships to receive the visa. So what happened was these Chinese, look at the picture of these Chinese workers. They worked all the time, 7 days a week. And so when you were a Chinese manager, you couldn't work the back. And so they would take turns. They would become like the manager, the merchant for 18 months, where they'd be the front house. After that, they became a worker again. Okay. And this was economically advantageous and also culturally advantageous for both countries. A lot of people don't understand that what Chinese people brought in terms of the restaurant is actually tremendous organizational skills, as well as large scale dining for many people. For instance, if in the past in America, a lot of people don't give Chinese people credit for this. You would actually eat at like a French style restaurant. It'd be extremely expensive. Most people could not afford it. And you'd be eating for like 2-3 hours. But when the Chinese came, the food was delicious, low priced, and everyone can eat it. And a large scale dining and entree where a lot of people eat it at one time, particularly their like ticketing system where they can like serve. And this is what they did in China. They served a lot of people at one time. And if you look at the old restaurants in America, you're looking at 2 or 3 tables, 7 tops, right? And that's a very fancy restaurant. Here you're having tables of 30, 40, 50. That's unheard of. But they revolutionized the dining experience. And that's something that people don't give any kind of credit to Chinese Americans who really wanted to turn tables and make as much money as possible, earning almost zero to no profit. Keep in mind that these workers often were not paid, right? And so in order to actually make that delicious food at a cheap price is you don't pay the workers. Now, Chinese restaurants had requirements, but they also had resistance. Okay, so if you see my right, my image is actually from the Christmas Story where they went to the Chop Suey Palace. So you had to actually, in order to come to America, you had to have a high grade fancy restaurant. You had to develop a fancy restaurant. And the owners can't do menial work, okay? But the Chinese people, they actually had resistance. They pulled their money together to start a luxury chop suey palace. This reminds me of the Cambodian Chinese donut shops, right? What they did is they did a tong ting, where like 12 of them would get together and donate or actually invest $1,000. And after 12, that's $12,000. That's enough to own a Chinese donut restaurant. And that's how the Chinese Cambodians dominated 90% of the donuts shops in California, right? So you see this Chinese thing, and also Koreans also do this. Koreans also pull their money in just so they all can get together and own and share and own a laundromat. Again, very difficult. You make no profit, very dirty menial work, but that's what they did. And that's kind of like a great kind of a cultural adaptation from Asia. Now, they take turns becoming merchants, right? And when you're a merchant, you can actually immigrate your entire family, males, that is. And a lot of them were, quote, paper sons, where they're not real sons, but they said they were in order to help run the business. Now, Chinese restaurants affect all over the USA. So Chen in Chop Suey USA, he talks about how Chinese restaurants give affordable luxury and democratizes the dining experience. It's adventure, it's naughty, it's some people even thought of it as the yellow peril a bit, depravity, right? Slumming, right? So in New York, groups of like these high socialites who are wealthy would like go into Chinatown and like see the shows. And back then, Chop Suey Palaces had like lots of shows and like lots of, grade A, entertainment with Chinese food. Now, Jewish patrons went to these Chinese restaurants, particularly during Christmas, for Americanization, to feel modern, okay? Because, a lot of them were immigrants, okay? And I would say that, being raised in the Midwest, a lot of African Americans also go to Chinese restaurants because, it's a delicious, affordable meal. Now, again, the motivation for these Chinese restaurant workers were to save, to get ahead, and to send money back to their family. And unfortunately, a lot of them just died and really didn't have a great personal life, but they pretty much donated their life to support their family in China. And that developed China and that developed the United States. And a lot of people don't understand that really positive um, thing. All right. So of course they encountered smell racism, right? In 1880s, they complained that drying squid was smelly, and so it drove the Chinese workers out of Monterey, and that's kind of interesting. And sriracha, right? In Irwindale, right? If anyone's had anything to pho shop, that sriracha company was, moved out of Irwindale, and then in Philadelphia, they said the grease smells were very smelly. Okay, so again, this like yellow peril, Asians are diseased, etc. Now let's moving on to COVID-19. Of course, the COVID-19 that actually originated out of Wuhan, China, has had a huge kind of effect globally, obviously with the pandemic. But I want to really train your eyes to this book. If please look it up. It's by Nanyan Shah. It's called Contagious Divides, Epidemics and Race in San Francisco, Chinatown. So actually, Chinese have always been somewhat very much linked with diseases. And that, again, is with the yellow peril, right? And I'm going to read the back of the book. It says, Contagious Divides charts the dynamic transformation of the representation of Chinese immigrants from medieval menace in the 19th century to model citizens in the mid 20th century. Examining the cultural politics of public health and Chinese immigration in San Francisco, this powerful book looks at the history of racial formation in the United States by focusing on the intriguing subject of development of public health bureaucracies. Shaw reveals how ethnic differences can be constructed and maintained by the modern state. Public health authorities depicted Chinese immigrants as filthy, disease, as the carriers of incurable afflictions such as smallpox, syphilis, and the bubonic plague. This resulted in the vigorous enforcement of sanitary regulations on Chinese people, residents, and workforces. Shaw shows how Chinese Americans responded to health regulations and allegations with persistent political speeches, lawsuits, boycotts, violent protests, and poems. Adroitly employing discourses of race health, these activists argued that Chinese Americans were worthy and deserving of sharing in the resources of the American society. So again, a lot of people don't understand the how Chinese have always been assaulted, right? Asia has always been assaulted by anti-Asianness, anti-Chineseness. And again, here, this is a recent article, China is a real sick man of Asia, etc. So again, it's ongoing. And so you see how there have been over 4,000 hate crimes against Asians. And that's not a new thing if you've ever taken Asian American Studies course. You see here, Donald Trump former president has tweeted, I've always treated the Chinese virus very seriously. I've done a very good job from the beginning, including the very early to close the borders from China against the wishes of almost all. Many lies were saved. The fake news narrative is disgraceful and false. So there's another study that every time Donald Trump tweeted about China virus and said the words China virus, there's actually like a tenfold or more than tenfold, 100-fold increase in hate crimes towards Asian Americans. So we had to link how our public officials have linked Asian Americans and Chinese Americans. In this case, they're together. So unfortunately, the anti-hate crime skyrocketed from 148% in 16 major companies, according to a study by Cal State San Bernardino. And there's a tweeting study that actually correlates to that as well. Now, unfortunately, this hate crime is mostly in California, mostly New York, but unfortunately, this one records 1,800 hate crimes, which means it has defined the definition of hate crime. Of course, there are thousands upon thousands of anti-Asian crimes where people are picking specifically elderly and or women and or elderly women together to actually assault and to murder, and it has not been actually defined as a hate crime, which I don't understand why, but uh, they are definitely hate crimes or anti-Asian crimes. So again, stop hate. I'd like you to Google that to look around on what is going on in the Asian American community. So now I want you to think about, and again, you cannot write a paper about this topic without reading as much as you can, reading more and more about how Asians are depicted, how Chinese restaurants historically have been depicted in order to write the paper. So now I would like you to if you can, to come to me on Wednesday and actually bring your draft so I can look over your draft paper and your arguments and your sources. So I hope to see you on Wednesday. Have a wonderful day.